Hi again guys, and welcome to another installment of Rivals on Gran Turismo. And in this particular Rivals battle, it's a five-way match between some of the early 2000s best examples of hot hatches. These are the larger scale hot hatches, not tiny stuff like Clios, that kind of thing, but the bigger ones, the Focuses, the Alfa 147s, the Audi S3s, those kind of larger, mainstream, attainable hot hatches which offer quite a bit of power, especially in tuned form. And actually this five-way battle could potentially be a very good one given just how similar many of the specs of these cars actually are. So, as we always do, we'll first of all break down each individual model's strengths and perhaps weaknesses in the case of some, and then of course go to a point shootout based on the on-paper specs to find our winner. And as always, if you would like more in-depth reviews about these cars, you can find those in the playlists at the end of this video. So, let's get straight into it. First up we have the Alfa Romeo 147 GTA, and straight off the bat, this is my personal favourite car of the five. It has an interesting combination of a much larger engine than you typically have in a hot hatch, being a 3.2 litre, but you combine that not with all-wheel drive or even rear-wheel drive, but with front-wheel drive, and that's not necessarily the cleverest of ideas. That being said, it's a really good hot hatch. Now, is it the best of the bunch? Not necessarily, but what it does offer is big, lazy power. Because of the fact that the engine is much larger than you typically have, that allows the car to have more lazy torque, even without the use of a turbo or supercharger. This Alfa is a naturally aspirated hot hatch, and even without turbo or supercharging, it still puts out over 400 horsepower and over 300 foot-pounds of torque. Now, interestingly, it's actually not that lightweight, even though it is front-wheel drive. The larger engine and the better equipped interior does add to the weight, and so it does weigh over 1,100 kilos, which is significantly more than some of the other cars here. So overall, I would say the 147 is kind of the Maserati of the group. It's the slightly oddball car for those who want to try something different. Next up we have the Honda Civic Type R. This is the facelifted early 2000s model. It's a pretty popular model, and straight off the bat this car does set itself apart from others in the group with certain advantages. You've got the VTEC engine, which is one of the most popular engine types in the world. It's lightweight at 996 kilos, and although it does have by far the least torque of the group at 247 pound-feet, it still has 412 horsepower thanks to a turbocharged 2-litre engine. As you would also expect, it is a front-wheel drive car, and interestingly, and this really is a big advantage in favour of the Civic, it is by far the cheapest car of the group. All four of the other vehicles are well over 40 grand. This car is only 23, so the value for money on the Civic is, I would say, pretty excellent. Overall, the Civic is a car for people who are more focused on track use primarily. It's a car that you can work hard lap after lap, but you do need to be careful with tuning, as it is a little more inclined to spin up its tyres due to the lower weight. Next up, we take our first foray into all-wheel drive hot hatches, the first of two all-wheel drive hatches in the group, in fact, both German, the first of which being the Audi S3. This is actually my personal favourite hot hatch that Audi has ever made. I prefer it over all of the RS models to come after it. Interestingly, and perhaps surprisingly, this is actually the smallest engine vehicle of the group at 1.8 litres, but it still puts out the same power as the Alfa Romeo thanks to a turbo, 414 foot-pounds, and it puts out even more torque than the Alfa Romeo. It is, though, heavier at 1,163 kilos, due to, in part, that all-wheel drive. Being an Audi, it has excellent all-wheel drive, which makes it a brilliant off-roader. In fact, of the group, this is the best off-road vehicle, hands down. The handling is very good, even with the all-wheel drive, which could very easily make it heavy through corners, but actually makes it very good. You can even make this car tail happy with the right settings. Overall, this is a very dependable car. It's an excellent choice of hot hatch, and it's also kind of a sleeper to some degree. It's not as showy visually. Our next pick returns us to front-wheel drive hatches, and this is by far the most extreme of the 5 hot hatches, at least in the world of Gran Turismo 6. This is of course the Ford Focus RS, and this car is pretty much universally known for being OP. It's ridiculously fast, the weight is ultra low, and it's essentially a rally car for the road. It just doesn't happen to have all-wheel drive. Even though it's not the most powerful of the group, the fact that it is so much lighter means that the horsepower per tonne is ridiculously high compared to all of the others. The PP is also significantly higher, and although the price kind of nestles between best and worst, the overall value and sheer speed that the Focus RS gives you is incredible. If you see the lap time here, you can already tell it's a lot quicker. You're looking at 2 to 3 seconds quicker than any of the other cars here. In fact, the Focus was the fastest of these 5 cars around the track. And for our final pick of the 5, we return to all-wheel drive again, but this time a naturally aspirated all-wheel drive vehicle instead of the turbocharged Audi. Again, like the Alfa Romeo, the Golf 4 R32 returns to a larger capacity engine and eliminates the need for turbo or supercharging. It's a 3.2 litre, but it's actually even bigger than the Alfa Romeo's engine, and it combines that with all-wheel drive, which kind of means that to some degree the Golf is sort of like a combination between the Alfa Romeo and the Audi in some ways. The payoff to that, though, is that it is unfortunately the heaviest car of the group at over 1200 kilos. However, it has the most power and the most torque, so potentially the Golf could be a force to be reckoned with. And although it wasn't the quickest around the track, and actually the handling isn't that great on twisty circuits due to the massive grip and the higher weight in a straight line, the R32 is the quickest of all 5 vehicles, both for acceleration and top speed. So that's the breakdown of each individual car, but now how do they compare, purely for the fun of it, on paper? Well, let's find out. Now, as we lay out the numbers of the particular vehicles, we've already covered some of the ways in which certain cars set themselves apart. The Alfa Romeo and the Volkswagen, for instance, both have significantly larger engines. The Honda is much cheaper. The Ford is significantly lighter and has a higher PP. The Golf is hugely powerful and the quickest in a straight line, etc., etc. It's very interesting to see how 5 cars, all within the same category, and all of which are direct rivals to each other, can all be so different. Each of these 5 cars really do have their own personality, and they're so different from each other. It would be very easy to assume that they'd be kind of much of a muchness, but that's not the case. Each one is definitely very different. Now, which one gets the most points? Well, let's run through it. First of all, we have the price, and that very easily goes to the Honda Civic at 23 grand. Then, of course, we have the engine capacity, which we already mentioned just now, but that does go to the Golf. Not by much, though. Only 9 cc of engine capacity separates the Golf from the next largest, which is the Alfa Romeo. As far as PP, as we already said, the Ford Focus is the highest by a pretty significant margin at 548. Then as far as power, we did mention that the Golf is the most powerful, again by a pretty decent margin. As far as torque as well, interestingly, despite the fact that it's not turbo or supercharged, the Golf still manages to have, by a decent enough difference, the most torque. 10 foot-pounds more even than the turbocharged Focus, which for a naturally aspirated engine is really impressive. As far as weight though, it swings totally the other way. The Honda Civic is very good, one of the few that goes under a ton, but by far it's the Ford Focus getting that point at only 877 kilos. And even though the Golf is the most powerful, the fact that the Focus is so much lighter and still has the second highest power means that, of course, the horsepower per tonne is going to the RS at almost 500, which is a lot more than anything else here. The second highest, in fact, as you can see, is, interestingly, the Civic, again due to the fact that the weight is quite a bit lower, over 100 kilos lower, in fact, and in the case of the Golf, over 200 kilos lower. As far as lap times, well, as always, we don't give that a point, but it is interesting to note that coming in first is, of course, the Focus, which has the largest margin of all of them in a 1:13 lap. Then the second fastest, interestingly, is the Audi S3. Then in third, it's the Golf R32. In fourth, the Civic, and last, and also the most expensive, but still my personal favourite, the Alfa Romeo 147. So the question remains, which one wins? Well, interestingly, and this doesn't happen that often, but we have a two-way tie for first place between, funnily enough, one of the quickest and lightest cars and one of the quickest, but in a different way, and also the heaviest car here. The Golf, which is the quickest in a straight line, and the Focus, which is the quickest around the track. Both cars, the Golf and the Ford, get 3 points apiece. Coming in second is the Civic, thanks to that 1 point from being the cheapest, and sadly, neither the Audi or the Alfa Romeo get any points, and that really is a shame because they're both brilliant cars. So, our joint winner is both the Volkswagen and the Ford, and overall I would say that all 5 of these cars are definitely worth checking out. They don't cost a ridiculous amount of cash, so if you can afford to save up for each of them, I would definitely recommend doing so. And which of these 5 do you like the most? It's certainly a category which has personal preference all over the place. Different people prefer different things. Front-wheel drive, all-wheel drive, turbocharged, naturally aspirated. Where do you fall? Well, tell me about that down below. And of course, as always, you can request or suggest specific rivalries for future episodes. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.